center on the horrors of the war and the frightening experiences of our people. This is, of course, quite understandable, for although the wounds have lost, many ugly scars remain. Our program focuses on some aspects of life in adversity that brought us together closer as a people. Except for the enemy and a lone U.S. sailor in hiding, everyone else on Guam was Chamorro. So in a manner of speaking, the occupation years was a big test for us. How we responded to that test, how we rose to the challenges imposed by an unrelenting enemy, how we survived, and how we are affected by that experience is truly a remarkable Chamorro story. December the 8th, 1941, Sunday Mass was just over, and my friends and I were having our weekly allowance of Coke and chocolate bars at the refreshment stand near the church. Without warning, with no radios, just rumors and panic, there was chaos. Not since the Chamorro War centuries earlier had Guam known hostility. Bombs were falling on Guam. It was totally unexpected and totally unimaginable. It was evacuation time. And on the way to the farm, my 4 brothers and sisters and I, and our 2 parents pale with fright, I asked my father what was happening. He said we were at war. I looked at him and I said, Papa, what is a war? He did not respond with words. He simply looked at me, teary-eyed, squeezed my hand, and continued in his hurried pace. I wondered to myself, is this the end? Is this the beginning of what? After all, I was only 13. By day's end, we reached the farm and we congregated around an old banyan tree at the edge of the property. My father leaned about a half a dozen corrugated iron sheets, which are usually used as roofing against the tree, and we crawled in under the banyan tree. A banyan tree, which in Chamorro folklore is known as Trunconunu, is the ancestral home of the Tautamona. You're supposed to ask permission, and there we were, without even seeking permission. We were too scared to even seek permission. I doubt if anyone else ever even bothered to ask permission after that. As did everyone else on Guam, we huddled wherever we could, confused and scared, comforted only by the presence of family and friends. We were to learn in the course of time that this compulsion to stay together, work together, and pray together turned out to be the bond that kept us from despair at this sudden disruption of our island tranquility. You know, total faith, loyalty, and dependency on America by our people were such that there simply was no thought given to the possibility that a predicament would last longer than just a few days. But the waiting was unbearable. Hours seemed like days seemed like weeks. After a few days in the bushes, so to speak, rumors were rampant that soldiers were landing at Tumon. America was back, and to many there was immediate relief. But this joy lasted but a very short while, because we finally realized the soldiers were the enemy. Another country had just laid claim to Guam, and the Chamorros were once again hostages in their own home. I remember my father saying, we survived the Spaniards, we lived the Americans, we'll survive the Japanese because, after all, this land is our land. By the 4th day of the war, Maslow's theory on the basic needs of man became stark reality. Like everyone else on Guam, our immediate needs were food, clothing, and shelter. Family members went into the city and the villages to retrieve many personal items, as much as they could carry on their backs. By this time, the enemy soldiers were all over the island. There was a pervasive sense of personal insecurity that sneaking into our own homes to get our own clothes was like stealing from our own selves. Agania had become ghostly. The bushes in the jungle with its canopy no longer looked menacing or frightening. They offered refuge, they offered security. Now that we had clothing, food was next on our list. It was time to push back the jungle and reclaim the fertile soil so we could start planting. The only source of food for us was the good earth. It was also time to make peace with the Tautamona. For those in my generation, our first course in survival, I guess you could call it Survival 101, was introduction to, of all things, a coconut tree, which in today's terms, I suppose you could say, it was the convenience store for the war, for it offered so many things vital for sustenance and shelter. Our elders came up with the most imaginative and creative ways to use products of this tree. At the same time, we were pushing back the jungle for more farmland. We were also seeking shelter, making shelter for ourselves. And naturally, The coconut tree provided much of the material. The leaves of the coconut will be thatched and used not only for roofing, but for siding and room dividing as well. These were the first mass-produced, naturally air-conditioned, affordable housing on Guam. We built them during the occupation. No down payment, no mortgage. They were deluxe models. No running water, no electricity, basic house, basic shelter, easy maintenance. With no provisions coming to Guam, the need for planning was on everyone's priority list, but the bushes were thick and the jungle awesome. A single machete would not make a dent, but there were more machetes and fusinos around than we thought was around. Spontaneously, our people revived an old Chamorro custom called adalak, meaning mutually supporting one another. For instance, when my father and I started to put a roof over our house, there were only the two of us. By mid-morning, the neighbors had dropped by to help us finish the job by sundown. We shared what food we had, washed it down with tuba, and then exchanged a few stories. This same community spirit, executed by a group of neighbors working together on each other's farms in round-robin fashion, extended to the felling of the jungle. It was throughout the island. This was true. For the enemy, we did forced labor. For ourselves, it was adalak, happy labor. It was human bonding at its finest, stronger than super glue. No matter what preoccupied us during the war, there was no getting around the fact that if you did not plant, you did not harvest. Corn replaced rice as a staple food on our table, and the art of making tortillas, starting with the grinding of the corn on the metate, was mastered by at least one person in every family. While the weather cooperated and pest damage was virtually negligible, the enemy soldiers not only demanded their cut of our harvest, but in many instances were responsible for damaging our harvest. The Army had brought to Guam huge horses that were particularly fond of feeding from our green cornfields. These new pests, the horses, required action on our part. The farmers who could resorted to building chicken ranches and planting vegetables and fruits in wooded areas inaccessible to horses and vehicles. What the enemy could not find, he could not help himself to. The jungle, once feared by us, had indeed become our greatest ally. For many of us who were youngsters at the time, exploring the jungles of Guam was quite a challenge. After all, the Tautomona had territorial rights in legend, in literature, and in lore. But we were compelled by the need to survive, so we sought an accommodation with the legendary Tautomona so we could share his hoard. Except for the pesky mosquitoes, which seemed to be the first, second, and third line of defense against intruders to the jungle, exploring it was like a visit to the magic kingdom. Wild yams, pigs, deer, fruits, birds, yes, birds, plenty of birds. And yes, pugwa, plenty of pugwa. And yes, no snakes, no snakes. The jungle was also offered as a special hiding place from the enemy, and my own family prepared a spot to which our younger members of the family and the women would flee when our dogs warned us of approaching strangers. Even in the most difficult days of the occupation, we somehow managed to find a little time for leisure and some Chamorro rascality. The appealing fingers you see playing the piano belong to one of our distinguished lawyers on Guam. He's a former speaker, a former senator, a former lawmaker. But what you're not likely to know is that he was also a former lawbreaker and a collaborator. During the war, he collaborated with me, Bert Lizama, Kim Palomo, and we used to sneak into Agania, past the patrols and the sentries, just to get to a piano so we could sing American songs to piano music. Of course, this was not a smart thing to do, but we were not very smart either. We did it for fun, and we did it in defiance of martial law. We wanted to see if we could get away with it. We did. But had we been caught, Ken Ariola and I won't be here sharing this precious little story with you. One of our favorite tunes at the time was, "Does Your Heart Beat for Me?" Frankly, every time I think about how close we got to being captured, my heart beats for me, even to this day. Although it has been over 50 years, it seems like it was only a few months ago when we were in one of the many rivers on Guam to get water for cooking and drinking. While we were in the river, we would swim a while, check the shrimp traps, and before the journey uphill through the jungle to our farms, we would simply sip water from the river. No pills, no chlorine tablets, no distillation. When we were thirsty, we drank the water. A visit to the same rivers and streams recently was a sad experience, which became sadder when we conducted tests for impurities. This unhappy situation is one of the byproducts of modern development. We had survived the war because Mother Nature gave us food and water, which we desperately needed for health. Now she needs our help. To put it another way, we simply cannot allow our springs on Guam to run dry. Ang isipilan zangin sumahi, wanay triste, sumahin niya. Historically, certain songs are associated with specific periods in our history. Vietnam vets of the 60s will never forget Tony Bennett's I Left My Heart in San Francisco. There were also songs associated with the Korean War, and we all remember Don't Fence Me In and I'll Walk Alone from World War II after the liberation. But for us in Guam during the occupation, two songs stand out in my memory because of the way they were sung the first time I heard them, from men singing while collecting tuba. One man would start the line of the song, another would follow from a tree a distance away, and a third one would follow suit. Finally, all four of them would sing a few lines together without ever seeing one another. In the still of the night, with only the brushing of leaves to break the silence. Hearing this song sung was so special and so beautiful that I cannot even come close to describing the feeling to you. You have heard Dalai Neni before. You're hearing it now, and bet on it, you'll hear it again and again, for it has become a symbol and a part of the days of our struggle. Beautiful and brutal, majestic and mean, unpredictable at times, bountiful all the time. Like the jungle, the sea was awesome and feared because it could be so destructive. If the jungle was the fruit and vegetable market for us in our search for food, then the sea, and in particular the sea inside the reef, was our fish market. The sea also provided us with seaweed. It cleansed our bodies, the sores and the scratches on our skin, and it left salt deposits on the jagged rocks along the shore. Since we had no refrigeration capability, salt was indispensable, an ingredient for the preservation of our meat and our fish. As we knew more and more about the jungle and the sea, we learned to respect and appreciate the abundance of our land and the resources of the ocean around us. This experience etched into our minds and our hearts forever the bonding between humans and their environment. It happened right here in Guam, and not so very long ago. You know, before I became aware of the political connotation of the term First Lady, I always thought they applied to the lady of the house, any house. I suppose it was because the men did all the heavy lifting, and it was primarily the men who did the fighting that the role of women during the occupation has not been highlighted. Now, my own family consisted of 4 boys and 4 girls, equal in number, equal in rations, equal in chores, almost. I say almost because an old saying states, the case of women better than anyone I know. A man's work is from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. Now, this may not be Pulitzer Prize poetry, but the point hits you right between the eyes. Our women were very strong and very courageous, and they had to be, for being a woman in a community under occupation by thousands of soldiers was a fearful experience. They accepted being dressed slightly more shabbily than they needed to be to keep from being attractive. They were always the first ones awakened in the middle of the night to flee to special hideaway bunkers at the first indication